in Substance, I find that the best way to do this is to create another layer, and instead of a black mask, use a bitmap mask, and use a curvature map that you've already baked for your model. So this will give you an inverted cavity map. When you add levels to this and invert, you'll basically get the same type of cavity mask as you get from ZBrush. So I like to change the levels a bit so some of the pores are not as visible because I don't need so many of them. And then add a paint modifier on top of that to paint out some of this detail on the lines, because on the face you never want like straight harsh lines visible. So you want to break them up. You want some of it there, but you don't want straight lines. So you can do that fairly easily. And once I'm happy with the way it looks, I'll just again change the opacity a bit. So this is what it looked like after I painted it out. Just tone it down a bit. So then I added some yellow patchiness and orange patches, orange spots. They're very subtle, as you can see. You can barely see them. I hope you can see them on the screen. My favorite tool for this sort of thing is a spots brush in Substance Painter. I like to change the alpha to a dirt stain alpha because it is round, but it's not too perfect. And it also gives you this nice sort of, when you drag it, gives you a different intensity of the dots. And you can again control the spacing of these. So the way I like to apply it is just do it in a bit of a figure-8 movement, so I don't create lines of like those. Just make it subtle. And after that, again, I added more layers of red, which is a bit more pink, and something I do a lot of when I'm creating a layer, for example, a red, something red. I like to create another one which is slightly different hue of red. So one will be a bit more orange, one will be a bit more pink, because when you look at real skin, you have a bit of each in there. Also, I added a bit more, like a strong yellow color and a yellower red on top. And again, I painted this with the dirt brush. It's basically my favorite brush. Right now it's looking very patchy, but we'll get to smoothing it out later. So I'm not worried about that yet. So I added another layer of yellow, this time a very bright one. And to my mask, this time I added a bit of blur, so it's a bit smoother. So you can just add a filter on your mask and the blur, and you can control the intensity of the blur. Then I added the yellow tones where the hair would be and the beard. And finally, to even it all out, I created a regular paint layer. And when you use a P hotkey, you can pick from what you already painted and just smooth it out. Put the flow to very low so it's barely visible, and just with either a regular soft brush or again with a dirt brush, you can smooth out all the irregularities. So this is what it looks like once I've done that. And on top I added another cavity map just to highlight some of the detail. And as you can see, this is basically, I consider this the base layer of the skin. It's still very blurry, and when you put it in Marmoset toolbag, it looks a bit painterly. It's not very detailed, but it's a good start. And after that, we can start detailing your skin. The first thing I did was something you would call in traditional painting splattering. So again, just a lot of little dots, brown dots, this time on a separate layer. I used the spots brush again for this, and I wanted them to be very tiny most of the way. I just added a few bigger ones on the forehead where I knew that he would have the sunspots. But the idea was to paint these little dots that you can see all over. This is, by the way, these are very young people's faces, so you still see a lot of tiny details on them, even though they're not aged. And this is the skin on an older person's forehead. And even if you're painting a black skin, you'll still have those little dots, so they will be just lighter than the skin, and a few darker ones. But obviously on a Caucasian face, you'll see a lot of it more clearly, because the skin is thinner too. So, and after that, I created another layer, basically the same thing, just a bit of a different hue. So you can see this one is slightly different orange. It's barely different, but it's different. And yet another layer of brown freckles. And this time I used also a dirt brush again, which I think I use most of the time, to paint some of them freehand, to make them irregular. Like some of them have very irregular edges, and you want to use reference for this, of course. And after that, I added a lot of like little arteries and broken capillaries and spots. One of my favorite things to do is to break up the lines of the face. So for example, on the eyelid has a line here. I like to add little dots on there or on the edge of the mouth, because it really adds realism, I feel, because a real person would have these, especially if a person has a bit of an older face. Again, another layer of these, but in a bit more of a pink tone rather than orangey yellow, and some orange discoloration, especially on the ears. And again, a layer of yellow to just knock it back a bit. One more characteristic is the purple under the eyes that a lot of people have, discoloration under the eyes. So I wanted to add that, make him look a bit more tired, just with a dark purple color. And some veins on the forehead, around the nose. And when you're painting veins, I like to use the soft brush on a very low flow setting and just break it up, because veins are not at the same level on the skin, level of depth. They change, so they go in and out, in and out. And from one of like really good traditional painters, I learned that when you put more intensity in between where the veins meet, it looks more realistic. So if you have like a vein like this and vein like this, you want to make it more intense here and then tone it down, so it looks better than just making it straight line. I added some lighter areas to the skin. Obviously, if you've seen scars, they're usually much lighter. And also the area in the corners of the eyes is always very light on most people.